Sure. I think as he left Barbados, there is really early records of him passing through Jamaica. So we know he went through Jamaica on his way toward the east coast of the United States, what is now the United States. And he ended up in the Virginia Capes. And at the time, the seat of the colonial American world was Jamestown, Virginia Beach, Norfolk area, what we call the Virginia Capes, Cape Henry, and Cape Charles, both of which still exist today, at least on the map. And they would go into the Capes, which is where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Chesapeake Bay. And he had early success. He took a handful of ships, let's call it 3 or 4, right away. Plundered probably necessity provisions, right? Things like cloth and food, things like wine, which certainly helped the crew. And he had early success and moved his way up the East Coast to the north, up to New York, and stopped, we know, in Gardiner's Island, which was had already made its name for pirates because it was where the only buried treasure that we ever know of pirates was buried. And I don't know that we have time to necessarily get into that story, but it's another one that's fascinating. But he basically just went where he knew pirates went. Yeah. Once he had some initial success, though, that's where his lack of maritime experience really showed. He went down to Charleston, which was a walled city, one of the the kind of premier cities of the New World at the time. It's along the same lines as, let's call it, St. Augustine, Quebec, right? One of these big walled kind of protected cities. Had a little bit of success there as well. And that's after that Charleston trip, he said, the record is not kind to him, right? It shows he didn't know what to do. There was consternation among his crew. Nobody knew where to go. And they went where all pirates went, right? They went off the coast of Florida, where they had heard that these treasure ships had sunk years ago and they were going to go fish the wrecks. Went down to Florida and saw a very large prize. And I think, the record's not clear again, but I think that Bonnet saw this big ship and said, we've had early success. It's not going to be any trouble to go take on this ship and get some provisions and maybe find a little bit of gold and something else, and let's give it a shot.
Let's explain quickly here. It's actually quite easy to be a pirate if you have a bit of sense.
Yeah.
You attack specific types of ships, you fire one shot at them usually, and they have to surrender, otherwise bad things are going to happen. That's all you have to do to be a pirate. You plunder it and move on. You can take multiple ships a day like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and shot across the bow, fly either the Jolly Roger, right, the skull and crossbones flag, or if you're feeling like it, you fly a red flag, which means that you'll provide no quarter.
Yeah, put some more scare into them.
That's right, and you'll scare. And a lot of, you're right, pirating is psychological. And I think that's obviously Bonnet's early success. He had not had any worthy sea battles by that point.
Yeah. It's also notable that just because a ship is big doesn't mean it's either well armed or well crewed. Lots of merchant ships were twice the size of pirate sloops, but had much smaller crews. Bonnet, his inexperience here, as he will tell us why his inexperience tripped him up here, thought that this big prize was probably, therefore, with a small crew, poorly armed.
That's exactly
what happened.
And he was wrong. Talk about being wrong. So he pulls up along the ship. He's flying his flag, and then all of a sudden he realizes that this Spanish merchantman is in fact a Spanish man of war, well cannoned, probably 2 or 3 times the number of cannons that Bonnet had on his small sloop. And Bonnet fired a shot across the bow and was not expecting the slew of gunfire that came. And that first volley from this man of war just decimated the sloop Revenge, knocked down some of its mast, eventually killed about half of his men. Bonnet himself was hurt critically, we think, definitely out of commission. And this small sloop was able to kind of sneak away after, like I said, 50 or 60 of the men that were on board, were killed. And the pirates, without the leadership of Bonnet, and I use that term lightly, without Bonnet being the captain, decided that they were going to go where pirates are safe. They were going to head to Nassau, to the Bahamas, kind of lick their wounds and figure out what their next step was. So they made their way south from Florida. And that, it really is where kind of the main story of Bonnet begins. Because it's in Nassau where, as Bonnet's recovering from his wounds, in some way he's introduced to Edward Teach, Edward Thatch, Blackbeard the pirate.
What have you?
Yeah, well, that's right. However you describe it, but the pirate that we know now mostly as Blackbeard the pirate, who at the time was not the Blackbeard that we know him. He had a small sloop, 6-gun sloop. He was part of the flying gang with Hornigold and Samuel Burgess and a few others that would go around the Caribbean, but he was not the pirate.
We should also say all these guys. Nassau's a pirate haunt because of its proximity to Florida, and specifically the wrecks of the treasure fleet that went down in 1715. We argue that the Golden Age itself was sparked by all these guys, ex-privateers and dangerous people, being so close to a lot of gold, and them going up to raid the salvage camps.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the other piece of it that's important is, there was no formal government in Nassau and the Bahamas either. It had been kind of abandoned by the formal government. So it really was, as was described by the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, a nest of rogues, right? It was just a place where these bad men with bad intentions and a desire to be rich and to enjoy the spoils collected. And there's some great books, The Republic of Pirates by Colin Woodward does a good job of describing it, I think. I rarely refer to television shows, but Black Sails, for example, does a nice job of providing you with a visual of what it was like. I don't know how historically accurate it is, but there are some historical characters in there that are fascinating. So
it'll get you interested. It'll get you in there. It's
that's right.
It's entertainment.
That's right. And it's really this piece of it, right, Josh, that I think hooks. Bonnet. They tie when Bonnet and Blackbeard get tied together. The future of piracy changes forever. And whether it was Bonnet's fault or Blackbeard's fault, you really can't distinguish between the two. And this is a piece that I think really has me still kind of hooked on Bonnet's story. And I think there's probably still more to be told. I'm not egotistical enough to say that I've told the full story of Bonnet. I told the story of Bonnet that I know at this point and that I've seen, but I think there's more. One thing that I think is really, really interesting is, as we said, Bonnet had just gone to the Capes of Virginia. He had gone to New York. He had gone back to Charleston. And then as he moved to Florida, that's when he was, got himself into trouble and ended up in Nassau. And soon after Blackbeard and Bonnet got together, Blackbeard took over being captain of Bonnet's ship, which was bigger than Blackbeard's existing ship, had a bigger crew, was probably more adept as the ship was built to do this type of pirating. And where did they go? As soon as Bonnet was kind of ready to go back, he was healed a little bit, they went right back to those same exact haunts that Bonnet had just left. And they went back to Virginia. They eventually, as we know, went back to Charleston. And I'm convinced that is more Bonnet's doing than Blackbeard's. There are stories of how the flying gang would have gone to some of these places, but just the timing of it, the sequencing of it makes me think that Bonnet had a tremendous impact on where the decisions to go next were, because they had intel, recent intel, and probably because if Bonnet could be successful there, then Blackbeard knew that he could too. So I describe in my book where they would have gone right back to the same places in Virginia Beach, for example, where Bonnet would have gone and used some of those same hideouts and some of those same sentry points. And that's not a story that's told very often, right? Which is why did Blackbeard go back to these places? And I think that's a piece of it. Is Bonnet was influential.
It's a curious thing, isn't it? When Bonnet and Blackbeard team up, you do ask why, and it's really interesting to ponder on. Blackbeard was one of the most intelligent. You get when you read about Blackbeard, you get the idea he was one of the most cunning, intelligent, psychologically adept guys out there. He was probably fascinated by Stede Bonnet. This is a real gentleman sitting in this nest of pirates, nest of rogues, and I can talk to him, and I'm interested. I can talk to him just like anybody else. In fact, I can probably dominate him. He has information. He has a nice ship. He has a good big crew. He's rich.
You can almost just see him on the deck of the ship, putting his arm around this Bonnet who's injured and out of shape, and said, "You know what? I've got this. I like you. You're funny. You're smart. You're fun to talk to. You're interesting. You got all this information. You're rich. You got money already, which I love. Blackbeard saying that, and I'm going to help you out. You've got what I need, and I have what you need. You've got a ship. You need a captain. I have a captain. I need a ship. And there seems to be this kind of symbiosis about it. There's a lot of other discussion too. It could be that Blackbeard was more educated than we think he might be. He was found the wreck of his ship. They found books on the ship. They found pieces of paper which they were identified as some of these voyage narratives that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I don't know if that all occurred before Bonnet or after Bonnet.
It's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, Blackbeard was captain. I think a captain during the War of the Spanish Succession on a privateer. That could imply literacy.
That's right.
At some level. Bonnet may have helped him.
Yep, and Blackbeard worked under, we think, Benjamin Hornigold during the War of Spanish Succession. So it could be that Bonnet reminded him of Hornigold, who was a pirate for a time, a privateer for a time, and eventually kind of came back and hunted pirates later. But there may have been some similarities too.
Could have been. And also, Bonnet was a flashy dresser, and Blackbeard becomes strangely flamboyant, doesn't he? That's interesting.
That's a good point. With the bows in his hair and lighting things on fire, and the double bandoliers, and the tricorn hats that he's depicted in later on in kind of subsequent wood carvings and general history of pirates. All of that kind of ties to it. The other thing is Bonnet was just simply likable. Right. Yeah, so the historical record has not been kind to him, how he looked, how he managed his ship. But what has been clear is that people liked him. And even as he walked toward the gallows, women wept because they loved the way that Bonnet was, and he shouldn't be treated in that way. And
he's a charming man.
Absolutely.
There's probably something in the idea that he actually was trying to play Blackbeard as much as Blackbeard was trying to play him.
That's right. Yeah, he may have thought that he had the upper hand of the negotiation because of his intellect and because of his wealth. And the reality is, he may have gotten the better end of the bargain, right? If he was looking for adventure, the next year or so that he was under that he was part of the flotilla with Blackbeard, he may have gotten exactly what he wanted out of the deal: adventure, relative safety, success, and traveling the world, right? So over the next several months after they left Charleston and the Virginia Capes, when the weather got cold in those areas, they swept out, and the record kind of goes away because they get into this Spanish territory, and they're in Tortuga, and they're just really, really cool places. And I imagine whenever I think of Bonnet and Blackbeard, I don't think of him holed up necessarily in his library. I think of him, out front on the ship, almost like the Titanic scene, right, where he's kind of laying out and he's sprawled out and he's just loving life on the bowsprit. And I don't know if that's true or not, but if he was looking for adventure, he certainly got it from Blackbeard. And the book, describes really specific kind of interactions that they've had with other ships. The historical record is great as far as having a number of depositions that were taken contemporaneously, where you can really kind of see who Bonnet was as a person. You can see that he wasn't overly flamboyant. You can see the way that he spoke. You can see that he talked intelligently, and it's just a fascinating story. And even at his trial, so kind of fast forward, right? He meets Blackbeard. They travel all around the Caribbean. They take all the ships. They blockade Charleston, which is a great story. Eventually they get caught. They separate. They get pardons. They go back to piracy, and they get caught. And you can only imagine that is what pirates do, right? They leave piracy, they come back. They leave it, they come back, and they get caught. That's just how it works.
It was how it worked, yeah.
Yeah, and what I was fascinated by is I found the trial transcript, which was published, the year after Bonnet's death, and really that's what gave me a lot of the information I needed to start the book. I'm an attorney by trade. That's what I do every day. So to read the trial transcripts was just fascinating to me. But what's most fascinating...
I was going to ask if that played any part in it.
Oh, absolutely. I could have written, a law review article on it, more than I could have probably, more than I'm qualified to write this book. But the book, kind of wrote itself as we went through all these stories. And what was most fascinating to me was not the fact that we were focused on Bonnet's success or innocence. I mean, excuse me, his innocence or his guilt as a pirate, but we knew he was a pirate. Yeah. But the focus of Judge Trott in the trial, which I think is really, really interesting, is more about the salvation of his soul, right? Which, and at least, American jurisprudence, we would never, the separation of church and state and separation of church from the courts, you would never hear that nowadays, of course. But Judge Trott, who, has family ties to piracy in a lot of ways too, which is interesting. Judge
people did.
Yeah, that's right. Judge Trott was focused on Bonnet being a liberally educated man and the fact that he was going to go to hell for what he did and that he needed to save himself. And you just don't see that in the law nowadays. So that's really the reason I included the actual trial transcript in the book, which you'll see as part 2, is because it's just a fascinating discussion between the Attorney General and the judge, and ultimately later on Bonnet. And we just don't see that nowadays.
It is very true. That is an excellent part of the book. I enjoyed that part. Now, that is a door. I need to quickly get that door.
Okay.
No, hang on. Okay, it's just the phone. It's the main line. Someone will call me if it's actually important. Okay. Never mind. Moving on. So, the trial. Obviously, we mentioned this earlier, but the way he was treated, like you say, was very unusual, and it is because he was a gentleman. And he was charming, and he could eloquently talk about his defense and what he did and why he did it. And we can't go through it all. It's actually quite in-depth. There's actually a lot more story to his after he was captured by Colonel Rhett. Rhett himself is an interesting character in the story as well. Yeah. But because he's a gentleman, he gets afforded considerations that other pirates are not afforded, such as to the extent that Colonel Rhett, like you said, actually offered, "I'll take you to England to appeal."
Right. That's right. Yeah, he was absolutely treated differently, right? So the crew of the Revenge, then the Royal James, they were detained at what was called Charleston's Watch House, right? It's a one-story brick building right at the main intersection, and you've got 30 prisoners backed into this kind of single-story buildings. So the conditions of confinement would have been atrocious. And then you've got Bonnet, on the other hand, a gentleman, a man of means, and he was actually kept in the house of a well-known member of Charleston society named Nathaniel Partridge, which is separated away from the other prisoners. Now, what was also interesting is Bonnet had already made friends in Charleston. So he had been there before, not necessarily off the ship, but he had people that were willing to help. And there was another slave owner, Mr. Tuckerman, who was instrumental in Bonnet's escape. So, this story has everything you need, right? Bonnet, smuggling women's clothing. In the Covenant of Darkness, Bonnet puts on, kind of a dress and a wig and sneaks out. Whether the sentries were on post or not, we never know. But he dresses like a woman. He sneaks out. He gets onto a couple canoes that are rowed by some slaves that were owned by Tuckerman, and they start to just head out of Charleston. In fact, they make it pretty far. They make it to Sullivan's Island, despite some bad weather. And at that point, the governor of South Carolina, it's kind of all hands on deck. A large reward for his capture. Rhett, who's already captured him once, eventually finds him. They have a shootout. One of his friends is killed, and he's captured again. So, it's got a little bit of everything. And you're absolutely right. It's because he was kept separately, that this could possibly happen.
But the tragic end is that, of course, the gentleman pirate, which is what he was commonly known as certainly after his death,
sure.
Found an end on the gallows in a very tragic scene, as you already have mentioned. And that brings up the the question of, I mean, he died very well. You know, he died like a gentleman. He died very bravely. But nevertheless, a rope's end is what happened. It happened to a lot of pirates.
Okay.
And the penalty for piracy was very, very stiff in those days if you were a captain. And obviously he was quite a notorious captain, despite what people say about him.
Right.
He was actually at the time one of the top, most wanted pirates.
Sure.
And that brings up the question of his legacy and how people thought about him and think about him today. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And you're right. I think Bonnet has what I would call kind of a split legacy. If you follow social media, people still post about Bonnet and they talk about him quite a bit. In fact, there's a comedy coming out on HBO in the next couple of years called Our Flag Means Death, which is based on, Bonnet's death.
I mean, just I know Taika Waititi is attached to that project, and it's like, okay, we can't take him seriously, but the man is comedy gold.
That's right.
If you want to spoof it, then
you can do it, and ultimately that's his legacy, right? It was kind of a series of inconsequential activities that just thrust him. It's almost like the Forrest Gump of pirates, right? He shouldn't have been there, and somehow a series of unfortunate events thrust him into the limelight. So I think that's how he's been treated. The reality, to me at least, having studied him, and I have an affinity toward him, and I'm not unabashed about that, is he's on, let's say 10 years ago, Forbes magazine did a list of the 20 highest earning pirates, and there was a study of who had made the most money during their time period. And of course, they looked at the provisions and the wine and everything else, and they monetized it. And Bonnet's square in the middle of that top 20. He's like 15th highest earning pirates, above people like Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, Edward Lowe, James Martell, fairly well-known pirates. And I think people have done a great injustice to Bonnet because we know that he was a businessman. We know that he was attached to Blackbeard, so he certainly wouldn't have been as successful if that wouldn't have happened, we think. But the reality is that he was. And he was on the ships when they blockaded Charleston for 9 days. They took 30 or 40 prizes. He made in a 1-year career $4.5 million in today's money worth of provisions and plunder. That's not a bad year's work. And
indeed,
despite his ineptitude at the captain, he somehow made it happen. So that's why when we talked earlier about who got the better end of the deal between he and Blackbeard, I think it's him. And he was well liked, as we described. And if you think about things that people want in life, they want to be liked, they want to be loved, they want to have adventure, they want to make money, they want to make a lot of money, and they want to do what they want to do and go out on their own terms. And to me, that's Bonnet's story. Is despite an unhappiness, I think he died a fulfilled man. He died early, but
it's
like when he looked back at the gallows, despite a little bit of sniveling on some letters to the governors that the record has shown. He
died bravely, but he didn't want to die. He was going to get out of it if he could. It's like natural enough.
You can imagine he may have died with a smirk on his face, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't all bad for him. So
the thing is, another strange thing about him is that he probably wasn't in it for the money, as we've been sort of saying. So
that's
maybe the fame was enough. The fame and the adventure was enough, maybe.
That's right. He was at one point kind of the most hunted man in Charleston or in South Carolina. And, I can imagine him sitting around that campfire knowing that he's a wanted man and saying, man, I've done this thing, right? I did it.
Yeah.
Here I am.
And like we were saying, he may not have been all there as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. The rational behavior of, man, I am actually hunted. People are trying to kill me. That may not have set in necessarily. As he was, huddled around a campfire with some of his compatriots dressed like a woman after a long canoe ride. So it's either way, it's such a great story. I hope to have done it justice. There are nuances and pieces that are missing, certainly. And I hope that people will help us research those and fill those in. I'd love to continue to have the conversation about Bonnet. People can certainly talk to me on social media, find me on Twitter, find me on Facebook, and I just love to talk. So, if any of your viewers are interested in that, certainly I'd love for them to reach out to me and continue the conversation.
Well, I will invite them to do so. I will invite them to buy the book. I've read it. The review will be posted close on to this being posted as well. It's an excellent book. It's one of the best books about pirates I've read in a long time, actually, because it actually gives you a great deal of information that most people just condense.
That's right.
So there's a snippet there for you.
Thank you.
So buy the book. You won't regret it. It's great. It's a great book.
Yep.
And a great story. I will put all the necessary ways to contact you in the description box below.
Great.
And Jeremy, this has been a great discussion, a great time.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on. Look forward to another conversation soon. I'm working on a couple of more books about some of the other more interesting pirates of the Golden Era, so hopefully we'll have a similar conversation about some of those soon.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Okay, well, then, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, please do all the things that you're supposed to do to let me know you liked it. And I will leave you with the usual thought there: have courage and have compassion, and I will see you all again the next time.